say
This
it's
conference
recording.
will now be recorded.
Are we good?
Yes.
Okay. I understand, Dr. Rubik, that you're a Capricorn. Do you identify with that at all, or do you think astrology is not meaningful?
Well, actually, I think astrology is meaningful. I think that's just a little piece of the picture, being born in the sun of Capricorn. But I think there's a complexity to the chart and the instant one is born. So when I was younger, I wasn't that interested in health sciences. So it's interesting because Capricorn often focuses on health and science. But in my maturity, I've been very interested in health. So it certainly looks to me as if I'm somewhat typical in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And so far, there's a lot of Sagittarians, a lot of Capricorns, and a lot of Pisces. And it's interesting that they're all towards the end of the cycle rather than early ones. Do you know your Myers-Briggs or your Enneagram personality types?
I don't know my Enneagram, but I know that I'm a high intuitive and high in perception. So that's a high N and P. On introvert, extrovert, I'm middling, and on thinking, feeling, I'm middling.
Okay. And it's interesting because so far only 2 people have been sensing rather than intuitive. So that's definitely a major. What was there about your childhood that led you to study chemistry and biophysics and get a Ph.D. at Berkeley?
My father was an ink chemist, and I used to go with him sometimes to his laboratory, and I was interested in science, and soon enough I had a chemistry set at home. And then I got interested in biology too. I had a microscope and was looking at plants outdoors and studying things under the microscope. I was broadly interested in all of nature. And eventually, after a degree in chemistry, I went on in biophysics because therefore I could have some understanding of biology, chemistry, and physics with that combination of degrees. But also because one of the key questions for me what really is life? Can we understand it? And nature to me was God's great work. And I really wanted to understand more about it. And that was very different from chemistry, where you often make synthetic things that are unnatural. So I was more drawn to the natural sciences rather than applications.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of religious background led you to have that belief that there is a God?
I was raised Catholic, but when I was about 12, I told my mother that I'm no longer going to church, but instead I'm going on nature walks with my father, who in those years didn't go to church either, because I found more holiness in nature than in the church. But I do believe very firmly in a creator and a power much greater than us, to which we're all connected. And I like Heidegger's definition of being human, and that is that each person, and maybe each living critter for that matter, is a pore of the divine, a little outpouring of divinity, very unique.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like this perspective because I've never met another person like me, and I'm sure none of you have. We're all unique. And it's a very special moment in time when we're born, and we serve our life purpose, and then we pass on. So life is sacred.
Mm-hmm. How many siblings do you have? I'm interested in birth order.
I have just one brother who was born about 4 or 5 years after me.
Okay, first of second. And then how did you arrive at Berkeley in California? Because you weren't born here.
No, I wasn't. I was born in the Midwest, and I have to say, frankly, in the 60s, I was quite excited about progressive movements and civil rights, as well as in the youth movements, the hippies. And so the Midwest was not the place to be. And I spent some time in Europe, in fact, before I went to Berkeley, being a hippie, traveling around and throughout Europe. I think I went to most of the European countries, and I'm sort of glad I did in those years because everything changes, of course, and um, then they were quite unique from one another and very distinctive from the United States. So I got a world perspective by traveling for some months before I went to Berkeley. And I chose Berkeley because it was extremely good in science. It's rated in the top 5 in my field. And so, besides having a liberal culture to which I could identify, it was a very good place to study science, and the weather was great. So, I had a lot of great benefits coming to Berkeley.
The Bay Area is beautiful. The hills and the bay are just gorgeous.
Exactly.
I was an undergraduate there, so I loved it for some of those same reasons. Then I'm asking everyone some of the most difficult challenges they faced in their life and how they cope, because I think that's something we can learn from.
Well, I'll tell a story about my first job after graduate school. And let me backtrack and say, while I was in graduate school, I got very interested in spiritual healing, or sometimes called psychic healing. In any case, laying out of hands. And I had an injury and was scheduled for surgery. I was, by hobby, a dancer. I still am. And I injured a knee, and in those years, they didn't have medical imaging except for x-rays. So I was scheduled for some exploratory knee surgery, and I didn't really like that idea because I know that it would be invasive. And so, joking around with my friends, I said, well, what alternatives do I have? And someone replied, well, why don't you try healing? And in those days, and we're talking the 1970s, there were no known healers that I knew of in Berkeley or anywhere. But a woman was coming from Baltimore, and her name was Olga Worrell. And she was a reputed American healer and psychic and held a church healing in a Russian Orthodox church in Baltimore. And she was coming out here to speak and do some healing. So I went to see her. I felt I had nothing to lose. And I sat down near her, and she put her hands on my knees and entered into a prayerful state. She looked in a trance. And I felt this rush of energy through my body, especially in my knees, and it was a remarkable thing. And then when I stood up afterwards, I had no more pain. And I thought, well, maybe it'll wear off. Maybe it's a placebo effect. Maybe I'm in a trance, but it didn't wear off, and I was healed. And as a result of that, I decided to do some studies on Olga Worrell while she was out here. So this was not my official research at Berkeley, and I was almost finished with my dissertation in those days, but I had worked on bacterial cultures, and so I took her into the laboratory and damaged some cultures and also had some healthy cultures as well. And she placed her hands around these cultures and was seemingly able to sense what was ailing them, whether I had poisoned them with an antibiotic or was starving them for a nutrient. It was fascinating to me. And I did find in some controlled studies that she was able to make, to boost their growth, especially when they were inhibited with antibiotics at low doses. So to make a long story short, this really changed my life. First, I had a special healing that jarred my thoughts of, instantaneous healing where I didn't really need a surgery. I don't know how something could be repaired that quickly. It seems remarkable. And secondly, I saw then remarkable effects on bacterial cultures in the laboratory by someone who applied conscious intention and energy from her hands. And of course, she thought all of her powers came from the divine. So she didn't think it was all about hers. So now I had data, and I really wanted to pursue this, and took a job. Instead of doing a postdoc at Harvard, where I was going to go, I realized this was highly unorthodox. And even talking to my colleagues at Berkeley, they were astounded that I would try something like this, and that I got certain results was even more amazing. So some of my fellow graduate students were perplexed, and some of them even shunned me that I would ask such questions that were so unorthodox. So I decided I better not go to Harvard. If Berkeley doesn't accept this, it'll be much tougher to do that at Harvard. So instead, I took a teaching position at a state university and then applied for a grant to study spiritual healing. And I applied to the Ernest Holmes Foundation for Holistic Health. That was connected with the Science of Mind Church down in Anaheim, California. And I wrote this grant proposal and sent it to the dean of the college, and he submitted it. He signed off on it, and I thought, great, I'm going to be able to do this. I'm at a teaching school, and they only care that I'm a good teacher. They don't really care what research I do. And then the grant came back, and I was funded. I was thrilled. I was called into the dean's office, and we had a talk. And then my face dropped because he told me I couldn't do this work here at the university. And I just couldn't believe it because he had signed the document. I had preliminary data. And he said, it's just too threatening. I'm sorry, you can't do this here. And he said, we'll put this money to good use. So here was my very first grant, my first academic position. And I was told that the grant was not to be used by me, taken away from me. And within 6 months, I was removed from my position. And they told me my biophysics.
This was in California?
Yes. So it was a state university in California. And suddenly I was removed from my job, even though I had very good ratings from the students as a teacher. And I really enjoyed teaching. And I thought I could do this rather unorthodox research because this was a teaching institute. This was not a research institute like Berkeley. There are many state universities that are largely teaching bachelor's and master's degrees, and this was one of those. So, and I was promised that I was going to be evaluated on my teaching skills, and they also signed off on my grant proposal. So now here I was in limbo, no job. The grant proposal had been absorbed by the university. Although I managed to talk to the foundation that supplied it, and they really were very upset about this, that the university would dare to use it for some other purpose. So needless to say, they had a negotiation with the university and were able to retrieve some of the funding and then give it to me. And I did the research in borrowed laboratories. And this was 1979, 1980. And now I had no job. And I found it very difficult to get a job because every time I walked into an interview, people would say, well, you have a degree from University of California, Berkeley. So why are you unemployed for now 3-4 months? And I said, well, I'm having difficulty with the scientific paradigm, with the reductionist paradigm of taking life into little pieces and analyzing it and trying to make sense out of it, trying to explain life in terms of biomolecules alone, because it didn't make sense to me and I didn't want to do that. So I told them I had a bigger vision of life and I'm not going to take a job to do this mechanical reductionistic thing, as I found in corporations and most universities, that I had a bigger vision of looking at the role of consciousness in life and the role of the biological field. And so I was pretty adamant about it and pretty stubborn as a youth, but of course there were no jobs like that, except one day I walked into a place where someone commiserated with me. The interviewer told me he felt very similarly, and he was surprised, and he gave me a hug, in fact, and hired me on the spot.
Wow.
So that was exciting that I finally found a place, although that unfortunately was on soft money and didn't last very long. So I would say early in my career I had a lot of difficulties because I was so clear about my purpose that I wanted to do this kind of work, and yet so thwarted by the establishment science around me that didn't offer positions in this and absorbed a grant even that I managed to raise for this kind of work. So I saw the university then as not a safe place to do research because you never know. A dean can change their mind. The administration can change. And so if you ask questions within the establishment's repertoire, their narrow vision of life, then you can exist in there. But if you ask questions that go beyond the mainstream, you can be in jeopardy. You can lose your job, you can lose your grants, you can lose camaraderie of your colleagues. But as I looked around, I discovered there were other people like me out there, including Nobel laureates like Dr. Brian Josephson in Cambridge University, England, famous for Josephson Junction in physics. Here's somebody who reached the highest level, the pinnacle of science, to get a Nobel Prize, and was also asking questions about consciousness, bigger questions, and how it fit with physics. And because of this, he was also shunned by his colleagues. Now, he wasn't dismissed from his job. He had tenure, and that's a different story. But many people who were like me were out there with a low profile, most of us, not like Brian Josephson, but most of us were just wondering what to do for the next step. Most people hold off on these novel questions until they get tenure and are well established in the university, but I did it early on and ran into difficulties.
So where did you find employment?
Well, eventually I was employed by Temple University in Philadelphia, and this was a dream come true because my job was to, I was director of a Center for Frontier Science, which means I was out looking at the maverick questions in science that went beyond the mainstream. And I was to find other scientists worldwide who were asking similar questions and doing experimental work and theoretical work, and hold meetings in Philadelphia and elsewhere, and produce a publication. I created a journal called Frontier Perspectives, and I had a budget. I had a couple of assistants, and I roamed throughout the world meeting people like me who were excited about questions at the cutting edge. And we distinguish frontier science from fringe science. You know, fringe science is considered off limits and really flaky. But frontier science is that area between fringe and mainstream that include questions that go beyond the mainstream, on which there's a certain amount of solid evidence already that the conventional scientific paradigm is limited and dismisses the data. So I was bringing data and collecting data, as well as scientists and databases of scientists on several areas of frontier science. And one was consciousness studies, another one was alternative medicine and complementary medicine, and the third one was on bioelectromagnetics, the interaction of living systems with very low-level electromagnetic fields, which was also dismissed by the mainstream because they didn't believe in that possibility, especially for non-ionizing radiation below the thermal limit. So those were the areas I looked at. Some areas were off limits to me. I was told by the initial provost at Temple, he says, you can't talk about homeopathy here. And amazingly, homeopathy started in Philadelphia in the United States when Samuel Hahnemann came from Germany, settled in Philadelphia, and built what became the largest medical system in the United States. And during the Civil War, homeopathy was the main medicine. You can see all the medical bags in the Museum of the Civil War in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There it was. But I wasn't allowed to ask questions about homeopathy, at least under that guy's regime. But when he left, and there was another provost, then homeopathy became okay. So you see politically how science was pulled and driven by personalities and I would say also economic interests and political interests in the university. At some point, I got involved in advising the Clinton administration because I was serving on the Office of Alternative Medicine, which was a new branch at the National Institutes of Health, finally examining evidence for complementary and alternative medicine, of which a lot of people partake in.
And I got very visible doing that. And yet Temple University had medical school, which was rather conventional, at least in those years. And I tried to involve them, but they were uninterested. So I could see politically there were difficulties inside the university for me pursuing these different topics at different times during my years there.
Do you find that universities have changed, or is it pretty steady course in terms of this reluctance to not study frontier topic?
I think it's pretty much the same, but when I left Temple University, I was pretty much done with universities. I set up my own nonprofit laboratory in 1997 and moved back to California, where it's a lot easier to conduct this type of research and where I'm surrounded by a lot of like-minded people who follow alternative complementary medicine, are interested in consciousness and field effects on living things. So I now teach at a few universities, but they're not so conventional. I teach at Saybrook. I teach energy medicine in the integrative medicine program. I teach at Energy Medicine University in Sausalito, California. And I've taught at California Institute for Human Science down in Encinitas. And I also teach at Acoma University in Hawaii. So these universities are not your large research universities that have a reputation for a certain paradigm. But it doesn't matter to me because I have my own laboratory. I get my own grants. I have my own philanthropists. And I'm outside of this madness of trying to do frontier science in an institution that is hostile and antagonistic to paradigms outside of the mainstream.
It's so unscientific. It's kind of, you look at it rationally, it's hard to comprehend. If there's data, let's look at the data.
Yes, it is. And I would say that, it's not too different from other fields of human endeavor. People are people, and things that challenge the norm in pretty much any field of human endeavor become unbelievable. And one reason is psychologically, if you hear something over and over and over, whether it's true or not, you begin to believe it. You take it as the truth. And we're trained in science, we believe in protons, neutrons, electrons, cells. We have a certain model, a certain visual view of nature. And then somebody comes along, let's say, and says, well, atoms aren't the bottom line, They're quarks. I mean, the quantum physicists had the same difficulties 100 plus years ago when they said there's a lot more. An atom isn't indivisible. We can divide it. There are subatomic particles. And one of them, Max Planck, said science advances funeral by funeral. That was one of the greatest quantum mechanists 100 years ago who said things like that. So nothing has changed. It's human nature to hang on to a view and hold it as the truth. And it takes a whole lot of data to change people's minds. But technology is different. I'm thinking back to the Wright brothers. And interestingly, even in their times, they got a plane off the ground. They were the first ones to make heavy beings fly because it was considered impossible that birds can fly, but that's one story. That humans and devices, they're not going to get off the ground. And that was the conventional view. But when you make a machine and you show people and you show them over and over again, then they have to accept it. They have to see with their eyes. Their technology can do things. So things advance, but slowly. And the paradigm is eroded, but it's usually slowly, but sometimes it's fast. I mean, Thomas Kuhn talked about revolutions in scientific paradigms when a certain amount of data is collected that you can't sweep under the rug anymore. It piles up, and pretty soon people rush to explain it, and then they forget that they used to be of another viewpoint. So I think the story goes like this. It's impossible at first, and then they say, well, it's possible. And finally they say, it's not only possible, we did it. So they ruined it in the end because they forgot that there were pioneers who went before them who maybe didn't get the fame and glory, but who created the trails, made the trails for which the mainstream then marched. So that's how things proceed. Pioneers making trails and then the mainstream pushing them aside and running forward.
How far along do you think we are in the non-materialist paradigm that acknowledges the primacy of consciousness?
Well, that's hard to say. It seems to me our society is quite bifurcated these days. There are people who really embrace that, not only scientists, but a lot of people are meditating and engaging in prayer and prayer circles together, or prayer at a certain time for world peace, or practicing yoga and having new realizations, and qigong and many of the old practices. They're taking these things up and they're evolving beings who really see consciousness having a foothold in the physical world. And then there are a lot of people who are still carrying on in the materialistic ways, which seems to be more mainstream in our culture because it sells and it's Wall Street and it's very much ingrained in the economy of how we see things as commodities. So it seems to me there's a bifurcation, and I don't know the relative numbers, but things aren't as they used to be with a mainstream. There's a lot of divergence in our society and maybe a lot of antagonism because of that divergence.
What's interesting to me is that in India and China, other Asian countries, they've known about subtle energy for, I don't know, 5,000 years. So they're way ahead of us in understanding the subtle anatomy and healing practices.
Yes, and recently I was in China, and the Chinese are now, or at least this group that I was invited to speak with, was quite fascinated by their own history, and they were excited about our research on qi, the subtle life energy, and they wanted to hear more because, you know, some of us, like myself, have been working on this for over 30 years. We have a sense of it. And some of the Chinese are just getting started because I think some of it was suppressed there for a long time.
I know that President Xi is interested in traditional Chinese medicine, so he may be encouraging them to rethink their past.
Yes, I see there's quite an interest there. And I regularly communicate with people in India who definitely have an interest in bringing the two together. I don't know relatively how that paradigm is in India. I know there's probably a lot of conventional universities that may also be stuck in the materialistic paradigm. But I would say that one of the problems is the university has become a continuum of big business. And that wasn't true in my youth, but now I would say we have the military-industrial academic complex. And so we have research about the commodification of life, tinkering with the DNA, creating patentable organisms and genes, and taking that into the marketplace. And a lot of universities then have corporate incubators. They have little companies that are spinning off from laboratories, from academic scientists that then go on to make money. And I must say I don't understand the relationship of all of that because the university is a non-profit environment. So there must be some way they spin off for-profits and that funds the university backwards. Because federal funding has become scarce in recent decades. So universities have to have more creative ways of raising money if they don't have an endowment.
Mm-hmm.
So this has thrown a monkey wrench into, I would say, higher values and spiritual or non-materialistic views in the university because they've got to fund what's going on there. They have to maintain the laboratories, pay salaries, research personnel, etc. And how do they do that if they can't get what had been federal grants for many, many decades back since the 50s and 60s that have since dried up largely. Well, I should say they continue, but they haven't expanded in the same ways that universities have expanded. So universities became very clever and started mixing for-profit and non-profit research in their environments.
Hmm. Before we leave the question of challenges, what about personal ones? Like for some people, having children is a major adjustment and challenge. What about you?
I didn't have children. I chose not to, and I'm quite satisfied with that choice in my life because I feel very dedicated to my work and have a strong sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important, whoever you are, that I would say the purpose of life is in having a life purpose and sticking with it. That's very important. And that may be multiple for many people, but for me, this quest to really understand life, consciousness, our place here, and to really explore nature, to be so excited about stepping into nature and exploring it, not only in the laboratory, but in my own urban farm environment, which I maintain in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I have chickens, I have fruit trees, and later today I'll be grafting different scions onto my fruit trees, trying to get some different apples and figs going. So just exploring nature in its totality is just such an all-encompassing thing for me. I'm really thrilled. I can't ever get tired of that.
Right. I have chickens and fruit trees in a garden too, and it's really restorative and meditative for me. If I'm in front of the computer writing, to go outside and weed is very restorative.
Absolutely, yes, and we need that. There's now the disease of sitting too long, and most people aren't aware of that. It's worse than smoking. So, in terms of bad for your physiology to be sitting hour after hour after hour at screens. Bad for your eyes, bad for your body. So yes, we need to get outside and get natural light and move and be one with nature. And that's a spiritual experience as well as gives me a lot of intuitions about what's going on as above, so below, as the mystics say, and I get new ideas just stepping into nature that I then pursue in my research.
Right. What kind of research are you working on now? What's preoccupying your mind?
One of my main quests is to understand the energy field of life. Just as conventional biology has pursued the biochemistry of life, the particles, there's another side to all of this, and that is what about the fields of life? And since I had an amazing spiritual healing that I attribute to the fields, whether that's from consciousness or the energy field of laying on of hands, I'm quite intrigued that there's a lot to the human biofield that's involved in health and healing and our general well-being. So I've been trying to map it in my own way through various tools that are commercially available and to develop detectors for aspects of the human biofield that have not yet been elucidated. And so we have a detector that Harry Jabs and I developed. Harry Jabs is my coworker at Institute for Frontier Science, and we can seemingly sense the dynamic emotional state of a person or a small group of people. So we have something that's recording continuously, and when people are in a positive state of joy, bliss, or ecstasy, love, then we see the needle move up. And when they're in a negative state of fear or anger or drawing in, then we see the needle move down. And so this is recording 24/7, and we can, for example, watch a movie and watch how that movie jerks us around emotionally, and even compare how different people respond to a movie. So we're hoping to bring this detector to make a smaller version of it that would be pre-production and then release it as a product, because I think there are many applications For one, humanity could use some upliftment of our emotional intelligence. We have a lot of computers today that can do cognitive transactions similar to our minds, but we don't have anything that can emote. And perhaps that's one of the important things about being human, is that we have the capacity for bliss, love, joy, gratitude, and that we have the capacity to, when we engage in those states, to help others move into those states as well. And I consider those um, spiritual blessings, really. So in any case, I'm really excited about our dynamic emotional detector, and we're in the process of fundraising now to take that to the next stage. So that's one thing we're working on. Another thing we're
Well, let
working
me
on.
ask you about that. So it's kind of like biofeedback. It could be used as a biofeedback tool.
It could be. That would take a little more development. We imagine that. We imagine that we could have a product that will reveal how many hours a day were you in a positive state. That's important because positive states are good for your health and good for the health of those around you, and probably good for your garden, like having a green thumb. So,
does the device hooked up, attached to an individual, or is it's separate?
no, there's no probe on the body, so we can be. We haven't pursued clearly what is the distance, but we have been at least 10 feet away from a person and can detect this field. So it's saying that the biofield, at least this aspect of the biofield, is outside and large around the person, that we have a sphere of influence around us, and we don't stop with the skin. And that's an important finding, because most people think that their extent stops with the skin. And that's a materialistic way of viewing yourself. And we're showing that a couple of yards or meters away, we still sense something from a human being, and we
Well,
can relate it.
EKGs do that. It can measure brain waves and heart waves from a distance as well, too, right?
I think there's a certain amount of heart waves that have measured a distance. The brainwave is, it could be possible. I haven't pursued that technology, but I don't know how far away one can go and get reliability with those measures. So yes, they usually put electrodes on the body in research and in medicine.
I know the heart math people are doing work on the field of the heart waves, or whatever you call it. So I think they've probably done the most on that, the biofield of the heart.
Yes, they have. Indeed, I use some of their equipment.
And then before we leave the device, I know the Scientology people had some kind of device that could measure emotions and truth statements and that kind of thing. Are you familiar with that at all? I'm wondering if there's any similarities.
No, there's no similarity, because the Scientology was, I think, looking at the galvanic skin response. So you held on to some metal electrodes, and then they were looking at how conduction went. It was more like a lie detection process. That was my understanding of it. So I honestly haven't looked at one of those per se connected with Scientology, but my understanding was it operated on the galvanic skin response, sort of like a lie detector. So there's definitely contact with the body. And then it would have to do with the sweat. So if you said something that was a lie or something that bothered you, you would sweat a little bit more, and that would register on the graph. And if you were relaxed, then you would sweat less. So they were trying to clear people by asking them unpleasant questions until they cleared them of whatever those feelings were. That was my understanding of Scientology. But I think it remains controversial.
Well, Scientology is definitely controversial. And then you said you were working on another device?
Well, not exactly yet, but we're starting to take a look at the effects of wireless radiation from communication devices. I published a paper about 4 years ago on the effects of cell phone radiation on the blood, and these things are on my website. So we found some bad changes in the blood from just wearing a cell phone in a backpack for 45 minutes in readiness mode, ready to receive a call or text, and then an additional 45 minutes of talking, using the phone, um, made even worse changes in the blood. So first the blood went from being normal, as observed under the microscope, with single red blood cells to blood cells that were aggregated into clumps and strings that we call rolls, like a roll of coins. And later those broke up and the cells were disheveled, spiky even, what we call echinocytes in hematology. And that type of cell is considered highly abnormal in hematology, and probably due to the radiation, the microwaves from cell phones opening up voltage-gated calcium channels on these cells. And then calcium rushes in. And this is, of course, a regulator inside the cell. So those are some of the latest ideas how microwaves from our wireless communication devices are affecting us. It's not just thermal effects, as the industry and the government says. The FCC and the industry has said, the FCC being the Federal Communications Commission, they've allowed a certain level of radiation to come out of our cell phones, according to the industry, that would not promote tissue heating. And they measure this in a ridiculous way. They have this mannequin consisting of a head and shoulders filled with salt water, and they have a thermometer in there, and they put a cell phone, they strap it on this mannequin, and they're looking for temperature changes inside the salt water of the head of the mannequin. And that's all they're looking for, thermal effects. But there are many non-thermal effects that have been known for decades, and somehow this is not part of our regulatory affairs of cell phone radiation. And the coming 5G, fifth generation of this, really has me concerned, because it's going to add yet a whole dimension of antennas in our very neighborhoods every 1,000 feet or so, and 20,000 satellites blasting not only microwaves but millimeter waves from space. That's the plan. So we've been scratching our heads, what do we do about this? How can we make it safe? Not that we're involved in the industry, but how can we help people protect themselves? Because I don't see that we're going to stop this rollout. It's approved. The government has approved it, and cities are now taking permits for the antennas, and the placement of the antennas in the cities is being worked out. There already are some experimental areas where 5G is being used, and they're ramping it up. They're going to put this all over the world. But there are no safety studies, and there are only guidelines and no clear-cut limit to what is safe and what's not safe. And then we have to ask, safe for whom? What about pregnant women? What about children? So there's just so many issues about our health and also the environment. We wonder what happened to the bees. Colony collapse. And there was some videos of 5G being experimented on in Holland, and suddenly 300 birds fell from the sky. I can't vouch as to the truthfulness of that, but it was said to be a 5G antenna, and people were picking up the dead birds. 300 dead birds all at once. So what kind of environmental consequences from this rollout? And what about health effects? We have seen from smart meters alone, people getting electrosensitivity. And the World Health Organization has talked about some 10% of the population now has sensitivity to wireless in some form, whether that be headaches or problems concentrating or sleeplessness or pain syndromes or a host of other effects. Heart palpitations is a common one. In fact, there were some students, young people in grade school that had
palpitations because of the industrial strength Wi-Fi used in the schools. And they went to school with heart monitors. It's unheard of. What's happening? The French outlawed wireless in the schools because of health problems and concentration issues. So yes, we have connected ourselves, but what are we doing to our concentration, to some subtle physiology? How are we impacting our biofields with these artificial frequencies from our environment, which is so artificial now? There were no microwaves, and now we have 50,000 times more microwaves than when I was born, except for probably some military radar, which was very low level and very intermittent. But now this will be everywhere and blipping all the time, digitally, on and off, with no place to go, no place to hide, with antennas every 1,000 feet and satellites also blasting down.
Some people sell devices that they say protect against those kind of waves. Do you think they're efficacious at all?
Well, it's important that there are studies on these, and I must confess I haven't seen any really good studies, except I've seen hearsay, and I've seen people put stickers on the backside of their cell phones saying, "This protects me. I know it does." And I say, "Well, show me the published study that indicates that it's protective." And they can't point to this. They're just going on marketing hype in most cases. So we hope to create such safety devices, such protective devices that would either shield people or perhaps strengthen the human biofield, or by other means help them deal with these radiations in our environment, because I don't think they're going to go away. I have a cell phone. I keep it off most of the time, and I use wired appliances. I don't think we need wireless mice and keyboards when we have a workstation and we're not running around the house with a piece of equipment. So there's a lot of use of wireless that's absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion, and exposing people to unwanted microwaves. They have to think about prudent avoidance, and then secondly, thinking about how we can shield ourselves as well.
You have pictures on your website of radiation from fingertips and how they relate to chakras. What is that all about?
Well, that's from a device called BioWell, BIO-WELL. It's a commercial device from Russia. That's one of the devices that we use at my lab to assess the biofield. And basically, it's a form of Kirlian type photography, which is high voltage electrophotography. So fingertip by fingertip, you stick it inside a device, and you're exposing each fingertip to about 5,000 volts. And then induced light is emitted around the fingertip, and we analyze that light. We analyze the brightness of it, the intensity, the various sectors around the fingertips where light is emitted that have been correlated with different organs and tissues and chakras. And we can give quite an assessment of a person through the fingertips. So it's how we apprehend the world, through our fingertips. And it's also, the entire field is really seen within fingertips or the whole hand. The feet also. There's reflexology in energy medicine and Korean hand therapy, where you can literally massage the body or give acupuncture treatment to the whole body just by pressing or needling points in the hand. So this is a concept that the part reflects the whole, the holographic nature of the biofield. So we're getting that information from fingertips, from induced light emission in that device. But we also have another device, and on my website you see me in a ridiculous black mask, black gloves, and a black outfit. What am I doing? I'm working with the human subject in a box, which is like a dark closet, where we measure the innate light, the natural light coming out of the body. For example, from the third eye, from the throat chakra, from the palm of the hand. and from the sword fingers. These are key energy centers that have been known since thousands of years from ancient China and ancient India. And we have some subjects who can literally open and close the third eye and emit less light or more light as they will on demand, who are medical intuitives, by the way, trained to diagnose people energetically, and they themselves can control the biofield. And we have another energy healer we looked at who emits almost 400% more light from the heart region when he engages in energy healing with love.
So what can those devices tell you about the energy field? Where it's weaker, where it's stronger? What are the specifics of what you can learn?
Well, we can learn whether, as according to Chinese philosophy, is there a deficiency of qi or an excess of qi, a stagnation of qi where the qi isn't moving, or is it all normal? And is it distributed nicely? The whole thing about qi, it's not how much you have. It's not like money in the bank. It's about the smooth, unimpeded flow of qi. That's what makes health and wellness. And that's what makes a healthy economy, not a stockpile of stinky money that doesn't move. It's about the flow of money. That's a healthy economy. So it is with our energy. When we're healthy and well, energy is flowing from earth and sky to us, through us, and beyond to others. And we're sharing in this energy, this divine energy, this life energy. So it's about the flow. And so around energy healers, we often don't see particularly high levels, but we see the smoothness of their biofields. And we see the control, because when we ask them to engage in a healing state, then they can really crank it up. And they may be drawing it down from a divine source or the source, whatever they believe, and putting it through their bodies into the needy, the sick. So we're looking at things like that in my laboratory, using different tools, energy healing and extraordinary states of consciousness, extraordinary abilities, and some of the exercises from ancient times, whether it be qigong, yoga, or different types of meditation and healing.
What about aura photographs? How do they measure the energy field, and are they useful?
Well, now I have to say, you're probably talking about a certain device whose name I won't mention, but there are devices out there that are more for entertainment or edutainment, but they're not scientifically based.
Well, what about Kirlian photography? Isn't that kind of the basis of it?
Well, Kirlian is one type, but there are certain cameras that have assessed at pictures of people with colors around their heads. Some of them have no scientific basis that I understand. And the Kirlian photography, we also have a Kirlian camera, and one that we made from scratch. And we have looked for example, phantom limb. What do I mean by that? Someone loses some fingertips, let's say in an accident, and then we had their hand with the stumps put on our device. We're looking to see, is there energy where the fingertips are missing? So far, we only had one subject come in, and he lost his fingertips 50, 60 years ago. So it's a long time ago, and we did not see energy coming from those fingertips. But he expressed that he had needling of the area where there's no finger, and he felt energy go up his body from an acupuncturist. So I thought that was a very interesting case, yet we didn't see the missing limbs, the phantom limbs in Kirlian photography. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but we will try with some other subjects.
Where they take off part of the leaf and then they photograph it and see the whole leaf, even though part of it's torn off.
Exactly. Now, we have tried phantom leaf experiments, and there's a paper from a couple of years ago in Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine by John Hubacher and others, and he actually was providing the data from some 30 or 40 years ago in that paper. Now, one of the things today that's different about 40 years ago is that we have digital cameras. digital cameras do not use film. But 40 years ago, they didn't have digital cameras. They used film. And film may see something more than digital cameras. For example, electrons. Photographic film would be sensitive to electrons as well as light. But the digital camera is not going to see electrons. So maybe we're missing something by using digital cameras today, at least in Kirlian photography. So we're going to be experimenting with trying to find some film. Now, Kodak no longer exists, and it's very hard to find the film that they used 40 years ago. There's very little film left. I think there's Fujifilm, but it may not be the same quality or the same parameters. So this is a complication. But I do think Kirlian photography can show a lot of information. And again, it's similar to the biowell, although it traditionally used film. It used a lot more volts, so you got often a shock putting your hand in a Kirlian camera. And today's electrophotography uses less voltage, and you don't feel the shock. So you're not so jarring to the biofield.
Is the biofield composed of biophotons, or what's kind of the nature of the invisible biofield?
The biofield is composed of many elements. It's, first of all, I consider it the organizing field of life. So in part, biophotons are one component. That's visible light. It probably also has ultraviolet. It certainly has infrared. You can go in for medical imaging with thermography, and they can see your whole body. You emit like 100 watts of infrared energy. But there's more. The body emits electric fields and magnetic fields and other invisible rays. It also emits acoustic fields, the thump, thump, thump of the heart. So, some organs emit more strongly than others. The heart is the greatest emitter in terms of electricity and magnetism. The brain is number 2, but the whole body is really emitting as well. So it's not just about the heart or the brain. There's much more. And then there's special energy nodes like the sword fingers, the second and third fingers that emit the most light out of the entire body. Fascinating. That's where we point. This is Qigong. Many Qigongs have used sword fingers or in martial arts. And we verified that, in fact, the right hand emits more than the left hand. The yang emits more than the yin. The yin is more of a receiver on the left. The yang, the right hand, is more of an emitter. And we verified all of this ancient knowledge by testing it with sensitive detectors in the laboratory.
Have you been able to find and to trace the meridians and chakras?
No, we haven't traced the meridians yet. That's a whole other thing. And the chakras, as I said, I've worked with a few, namely the third eye, the throat, and the heart, which are the easiest to image, at least in the frequency range that I've been working. We haven't dealt with the lower ones as much.
So when you image it, what do you see?
Well, we're actually just counting photons. We're measuring the amount of light. So we're not imaging because that would take really special cameras and a lot of time. And people, of course, are moving from state to state in consciousness. So if they had to sit still for an hour and be in the same state, that's difficult. So it's easier for us to do faster measurements to get a sense of energy emission in shorter times, and then people maintain the state over a few minutes.
Do you see differences in meditators? You know, the University of Wisconsin shows that meditation changes the brain. Have you done studies of meditators, and do you meditate?
I did one study on meditators, comparing meditators and non-meditators, and found that meditators could, with greater ease, make high-frequency brain waves, namely 40 hertz, 40 cycles per second. And that's a special wavelength that's been associated, coming from the brain that is, with bliss and joy. And meditators were able to do that on demand with some biofeedback much more readily than non-meditators. So that was an interesting result. I do meditate. I should say I'd like to do it even more than I do, but I find it extremely worthwhile. We need to unplug from the external world and realize there's a whole world within us, and to keep in touch with that source, that connection.
Do you use a mantra, or do you try to keep your mind blank, or what helps you meditate?
Well, when I was a teenager, I actually learned transcendental meditation. That's when the Maharishi was coming to the United States in the 60s, and I got a mantra. I was assigned a certain mantra, and I learned that transcendental meditation, and I've kept that up for many years. But I also like another kind of meditation where you just focus on the breath. I also find that very relaxing. So I alternate between the two types.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that in the future that healthcare will use these kind of devices for diagnosis and treatment, so it'll be part of the mainstream medical care?
Well, we have a ways to go before those will become medical devices. And you know, one of the complicated things in the United States is the requirement that they satisfy the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And in order to become FDA approved, you have to go through 3 levels of clinical trials for safety, for efficacy, and then large numbers. Those trials cost a lot of money. And so far, very few energy medicine type devices have been able to obtain the money to go through these levels of FDA trials. So, in my opinion, energy medicine remains in the doghouse because we have a pharmaceutical medicine that's so strong and so restrictive on other types of medicine. It really doesn't want the competition. So the FDA, which is largely composed of people from the industry, from the pharmaceutical medical industry, who go in and out of FDA and the industry, have shown some bias or difficulty in getting devices through, plus the funding problem, because we don't have a rich industry that would take us through these 3 levels of expensive federal trials to satisfy the FDA. So that's the complication. So I would have hoped that at this stage in my life, energy medicine would have made much more progress than it has. I don't know that I'm going to live long enough to see all of these things become medical devices, but at some point they will, especially if the stronghold on the FDA lightens up. Because it would be extremely helpful to have other types of medicine besides pharmaceutical. And there are some energy medicine devices out there. For example, there's transcranial head stimulation for mood disorders and sleeplessness. That's one of the hallmarks of energy medicine. There's bone healing devices for non-unit fractures. So if your broken bone is not healing well, you can get pulse magnetic field stimulation. And there's pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, which is very good for pain and sports injuries and a host of things. And those are some of the hallmarks of energy medicine. But there are so many more devices sitting in limbo for lack of funding and not taken through the FDA as experimental devices because of the sheer costs involved.
What
and many
about,
of them are offshore. Many of them are medical devices outside of the United States. For example, BioWell, which is an assessment device. It's not a healing device, but it assesses the biofield, is a medical device in 32 other countries, not in the United States. Here, we use it to assess energy, so it's a wellness type device, but it does not have a foothold in medicine.
what about the Rife machine? I think maybe that's the most well-known device that people use for healing.
Well, the Rife machine, as far as I understand it, is not legal in the United States. And I have known people who were selling it, who were rated by the FDA at least some 10 years ago. I don't know. I don't believe it's become accepted yet.
I don't think you have to get it in Canada. You have to purchase it in Canada.
Yes. I did meet the technician of Royal Rife some 30 years ago. His name was John Crane. He's passed on. But he was terrified to talk about these things because he saw what had happened to Royal Rife. And I have tried to get the device out of the bowels of the FDA into the Smithsonian Museum. We could have an exhibit on the history of medical devices in the United States. Wouldn't that be interesting? So we could finally see, what did Royal Rife do? What were his frequencies? What did the device look like? Lots of people are claiming that they have Rife-type devices when we don't really fully know, because it's been confiscated and hidden from us for decades. And so we don't know what Rife did, and we can't say there are Rife devices out there. I don't believe it, because I knew the closest person to Royal Rife, and I knew that he wasn't going to talk about it. So I have a lot of doubts about these devices sold purportedly as Rife devices. Now, there are square wave devices. What are they? Well, they put out waves that are square, and square waves actually hold a lot of different frequencies. It's sort of like you might need vitamin B, but if you take a multiple vitamin, then you might just get enough. So a square wave is like, let's give you all these frequencies and then you can take what you need. But the problem with that is there may be some deleterious frequencies among them, not good for you. So we're not sure what we're getting with the square wave generators, but they're out there.
What
And
about
I don't think they're legal also in the United States.
what about Harry Oldfield, the British electrocrystal machine? Are you familiar with that?
No.
He was a British science teacher, and he started doing Trillian photography and was surprised to find auras and chakras. He didn't know what those things were, and then he developed a camera and a machine that sends frequencies through glass tubes that have different kind of crystals in them, and then you adjust the machine for different frequencies.
Well, there are a lot of devices out there. I can't keep up with all of them, I have to tell you. Every year, there's yet more devices and more claims, and often without third-party published studies. And without that, even tiny pilot studies, I'm skeptical. You have to be skeptical. They're selling these things for thousands of dollars in some cases, many thousands. And where's evidence of validation? Where are the validation studies? There are none. Often word of mouth, testimonials, not good enough for me. I'm a scientist. I'm not putting my money on something that's not been validated. And I suggest the public demand validation before they also put their money down. It's just unreasonable.
There was another machine that came out of Austria that an American had to move to Austria. I've forgotten what it was called, but there was kind of a buzz around that machine for a while. Does that ring a bell?
I'm sorry, it doesn't.
Okay. Let's talk about what the evidence is for energy healing, like Reiki and Joe Ray and polarity therapy and external chi therapy and therapeutic touch and magnet therapy.
Well, you know, I did a study funded by NIH in about 2001 on Reiki, showing its effects on bacterial cultures, which actually was a very professional and extensive version of the study I did in my youth. Finally got some funding from NIH to follow up. And indeed, first we found good effects on pain patients with Reiki in the study, and we found effects on bacteria that when the bacteria were heat shocked, which actually killed about half of them and totally crippled the others, the Reiki facilitated their growth following heat shock. So that was a clear finding that there's more to it than placebo. You could always argue that pain improvement or mood improvement or anxiety relief is placebo effect. Somebody's laying hands in your field or on your body. But when you see effects on cell cultures, That's not a placebo effect. So my study, and there are others on uh, cultured cells, etc., as well as on plants. These are demonstrations that something beyond the level of a placebo is happening, that energy has to be involved. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such an effect.
Did you do sham healers, like people who weren't trained in Reiki, hadn't had the Reiki attunement, but just used their intention to work on the cultures? I mean, was there anything difference between Reiki healers and untrained, good intentioned healers?
Well, I didn't want to use sham, and I deliberately didn't, because everybody has a field, and you can have actors trained to do, something and think about something else, but there will be an effect. And frankly, I think it's not a very good control. So my controls were having no healer. And then everything was blinded, double blinded, in the sense that I had technicians label everything and I did the assays. So that I didn't know which were the control test tubes of bacteria and which were the Reiki treated. So it was still adequately controlled, but no, I didn't use sham healers. And I mean, it's very hard to have shams in energy medicine. What is sham acupuncture? That's another one. Do you tape needles to someone's body? I've seen that done. But the person knows the difference. The person receiving a taped on needle versus a needle inserted. So it's not the same as the drug culture, where we can give placebo pills, sugar pills, or candy-coated sugar pills. It's and sometimes we have to think that those kinds of controls are certainly perfectly sensible for drug trials, but not for energy medicine. We have to rethink what is an appropriate control, and not stoop so low as to do some silly sham healing because to satisfy that mentality. So we have to rethink the clinical trial. And I also like outcome studies without controls, but where the people who are sick serve as their own controls. They were sick, they were followed for so long, and then they get the intervention of energy healing, and then the follow-up. That's a good study. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think we have to let go of some of these shams in energy medicine. Now, with a device, it's different. You can always turn a device off. You can even have certain lights appear that it's on, LEDs or something. But if you turn it off and use it and it's not having an effect, that's a good sham. But with people, it's very tricky to talk about sham healings.
I've seen studies that they put people in MRIs and stimulated sham acupressure points and acupressure points, and the acupressure points lit up the brain in a way that the sham acupressure points didn't. So it was possible to measure sham acupressure points.
Good.
What's magnet therapy, bioelectric magnetic therapy, electrodermal therapy, phototherapy? What's that?
Well, I especially like phototherapy. But I'll tell you a story about magnet therapy because I once sprained my ankle in an exercise class not too far from Chinatown, San Francisco. I was up on Nob Hill in a hotel. And my ankle's getting swollen now, and so I'm limping down the hill going towards Chinatown for lunch. But what did I see but a health store based on Oriental medicine? And I went in there and got magnets, and the storekeeper showed me how to put the ring of magnets around my swollen ankle. And then I went to lunch, and much to my amazement, the swelling of my ankle was going down, just from a string of magnets placed around a swollen new sprain. So there's something there, and we understand the physics of that. It's called the Hall effect. So you bring a magnetic field close to the body, and it changes the path of charged particles. The flow of lymph and blood is influenced by magnets on the body. But that kind of magnet therapy with static magnets, little handheld magnets, only works over short term. The body adapts to it over long term, but it's very good for injuries. Phototherapy is another amazing thing. Strong light brought into the body, whether it's infrared or visible or some combination, do amazing things. I'm seeing a doctor now in California treating some dementias with phototherapy to the head. In other words, these people are suffering from things like Alzheimer's. They're shuffling in his office. They have no emotional affect. They're looking at the floor and kind of shuffling in. 20 minutes of light therapy to the skull, and they're suddenly their old selves. They're personable. They're walking. They're shaking your hand. They're talking again. Now that doesn't last. They come back for a few treatments and it's more lasting. So I think there's incredible hope. And we can expect a lot more dementias as the population is aging, and also exposed to a lot more microwaves, which is anticipated to cause more dementias. So these types of therapies are doing miraculous things where there's little other hope. The drugs just don't have that powerful an effect.
Is it a particular kind of light that's beamed into the head, or what's special about the light?
Well, I'm not privy to all the details, and it is an experimental study, but I can say that the light includes some colored, visible light, some very strong LEDs in the blue and magenta, and then there's some infrared as well. And infrared is very penetrating. Maybe 5 to 10 centimeters into the body, and so can work at a much deeper level. I've used infrared therapy for sports injuries too. I think NASA pioneered that for the astronauts because if they're injured in space, they need something to help with the pain and swelling. And infrared, there are now, these are sold in the marketplace, also for cosmetics. People claim that infrared applied to the face is helpful to ward off wrinkles and sagging flesh. So I think there's a tremendous application of energy for some small things like beauty, as well as deep injuries and serious chronic illnesses like Alzheimer's.
There's a lot of infrared electromagnetic devices out there. How does one know which one is really efficacious?
Well, again, you go to a physician for the deep phototherapy, and there's not many doctors doing this yet. It's still largely experimental in the United States, but it's been well known elsewhere for a long time. And for example, in Russia, they've used a lot of laser therapy. And I'm not talking about laser eye surgery. I'm talking about lasers for deep healing. And so that's been known for decades there, but hardly known here. So consumer products I'm not so knowledgeable about. They're out there. I would say most infrared LEDs on the market, near infrared would be most appropriate for wound healing and sports injuries that are sold over the counter for just general home use.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I'd like to say is diabetic neuropathy. We have an epidemic of diabetes in this country, and some of the complications are numbness in the feet, and then even gangrene or tissue death in the feet and legs. And that phototherapy can turn that around. So instead of going for an amputation, losing a limb, one could try phototherapy and reverse some of these necrotic diseases that are killing nerves and tissue on the feet and legs. There's tremendous benefit there. What would you rather have, an amputation or painless therapy without any side effects, phototherapy? That's the power of energy medicine. It's a no-brainer.
It's a no-brainer. By pranic healing, is that synonymous with qi, using the subtle energy field in a specific way?
Pranic healing is a specific type of energy healing. Pranic healers, I believe, go through an initiation. It's a spiritual practice. Personally, I haven't studied pranic healing, but I'm familiar with it and I have a high regard for it.
What about polarity therapy?
I'm familiar with it again. I haven't done any studies on it.
Have you been done the Reiki training or done any particular kind of energy healing yourself?
Although I can do some energy healing, I've deliberately not gone through the Reiki training because I didn't want it to be known that I would be a Reiki person studying Reiki. I thought that would be seen by some as a conflict of interests, and that I would be taken less seriously as the scientist studying it. So I have kept my distance from that, but that doesn't mean that at some stage in life I may do that, because I think self-Reiki as well as Reiki on others, these are all very important modalities, important skills.
It seems to me that the intention is the key, just intending to be a channel for healing energy. That's what counts.
Well, another interesting thing from my study on Reiki, we did find differences between the practitioners, and that was not a result that they liked. Let me say that they think that Reiki is all the same. It doesn't matter what state of consciousness you're in. You apply the method and you get results. But I could see that some of the practitioners in the study were concentrating harder, were more attuned to the whole experiment, and we had better results with them. And then there was one day when we got reverse results with a Reiki practitioner on the bacteria. In other words, she treating the bacteria, the needy bacteria, she actually produced less growth in the bacteria. And then we had a long talk about that. What happened on this day? And she admitted she had a bacterial infection that day.
Oh.
She came in anyway. She had a bladder infection.
Oh.
And the same species of bacteria, E. coli, was probably giving her a bladder infection that we asked her to treat in the laboratory. And according to the principles of Reiki, it goes where it needs to go for the highest good. So the highest good that day was healing the healer and not our cultures and test tubes. So that was very gratifying to understand that. And that healers, when they're ill, should not be practicing. Was another amazing realization. They must be well, or that the Reiki that they're producing is only going to go back to them and not the person they're treating. So these little bits of data that show up in experiments are important clues as to
Very important. Hospitals seem to be most comfortable with therapeutic touch and now with Reiki, because nurses have been trained to do therapeutic touch. And you found that they use different frequencies that can be measured?
No, I haven't measured the frequencies, actually. I'm only measuring the effects of Reiki. Although I should say with our emotional detector, we see, it depends on the practitioner again. What is their emotional state at the time we measure them? And that's quite variable. So I think there are so many parameters really in these healing arts that have yet to be analyzed. The mood of the practitioner, and the practice of Reiki and the other healing modalities also increases the mood. It gives them a stronger spiritual connection. That was one outcome from our study as well. They benefit dramatically, psychologically and physically, from the practice of the healing art.
Mm-hmm.
They also benefit, their health is strengthened. And that's another reason they like to practice. They feel better doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So in helping others, they help themselves.
Right, because they're channeling healing energy. It comes through them to the person they're working with. So yeah, they get the benefit. You mentioned that water has subtle properties like memory, and that to me is very interesting, because they say that 80% of the human body is water. So if you can impact water, that's pretty profound.
Yes. Well, we've definitely done studies on water nearby as well as far away, and we can see changes in the energetics of the water. We had a meditation group in the San Diego region. That's I don't know, maybe 700 miles from San Francisco Bay, and they were sending energy to. We didn't know which water station. We had two different beakers at different stations, and they randomly decided which one to treat remotely, sending energy. And it was a group of meditators, and then we compared the two waters, and we were blinded. We didn't know which one they treated. And I think it was in virtually every case we could tell which one they had energized across many miles. How does that
How?
work?
What was different about the water that
Well,
was?
again, we looked at the hanging water droplets. So we had a syringe of water with a little drop hanging. We put it just above the Kirlian camera lens, and we turned on the electricity. So then we measured the induced light coming out of the water. There was more light, a more complex pattern of light coming out of the water that they had sent the energy to compared to the control water. And both waters were from the same source. They were the tap water in our laboratory. So the only difference was they were sending energy to only one of them, and we didn't know which one. But in the end, we showed them all the photos and told them, and they went back and forth, switching the stations too in all the experiments. So clearly, distance doesn't even matter when it comes to healing intent. Although the literature does show that being present in the same location with a healer seems to have somewhat stronger effects on patients. But in experiments, we also see effects across many miles, and it's remarkable.
What do you think of Dr. Emoto's water crystals, of imprinting the water with negative or positive and getting different crystal forms?
Well, I was intrigued. It certainly is a beautiful idea, but then I found out that they might have been cherry picking. In other words, they weren't doing it with the same level of blindedness. If someone thought about love, then they're going to look for a pretty crystal to match that. That's what cherry picking means. But Dr. Emoto was a practitioner, not a scientist. I think he raised our consciousness tremendously about the power of conscious intent and how it impacts the water around us and within us. And that's the important message, and maybe not the details of his experiments. People have asked me whether I'd replicate it, but I don't have a walk-in refrigerator where I can put my microscope, or I need a cold stage, really, too. I just don't have the parts of a microscope to do that, but I think someone should replicate it. It would be worthwhile. And using some blindedness. In other words, so the scientist doesn't know what is the emotion being thought here, so that we can just photograph the crystals and then have a team of judges, again, who don't know all the details, judge them for beauty. But I think it's clear that water changes structure with conscious intention. Water can change structure with many influences from the environment. I would say water takes on qualities of its environment. And even the water that crystallized at a higher mountaintop with a certain configuration, then brought down the mountain and crystallized again, shows a residue of the structure that it learned up in the top of the mountain. So water has a memory. And this is an amazing thing. I don't know the length of that memory, but water is continuously getting information from its environment, including emotions and thoughts, and shifting its structure. And it's not just so simple, this H2O. It sounds like a simple molecule, but clearly it's much more complex. And I'm going again to the International Water Conference this year, which will be in Germany, where a bunch of people from around the world, scientists worldwide, are exploring some of these unusual questions about water and its novel properties. So that will be in Germany in late 2019.
Some people say it's really important for health maintenance to drink alkalized water. Do you agree with that, or does it matter?
Well, I drink water from an ionizer that is not only alkaline. You can make alkaline water by putting a pinch of baking soda in water, but that's not enough. You want water slightly alkaline, but also rich in electrons, because that's how water flows on Earth. It would be rich in electrons, but the water coming out of the tap is deficient in electrons. And that has to do with how we process water in municipal water plants. So you can't drink water flowing on Earth unless you've got a well water or a very pristine creek where no deer poop is present because you might get giardia. So you want something that restores the electricity in water. And that's why I recommend an electric ionizer.
Hmm.
So filters the water, removes the fluoride, the chlorine, and all of that, and then puts water over electrodes, and you drink the alkaline fraction over the cathode, which is rich in electrons. And I've been drinking that water for over 20 years. I recommend it to all of my clients.
Mm-hmm. What other kind of health maintenance suggestions like that do you give them?
Well, I think one of the most important things you can do is exercise, as well as drinking enough water. By the way, the energy field of the body collapses if you're dehydrated. You've seen this time and time again. So the minute you drink and rehydrate, within a short time, the body snaps back energetically. And I think lots of people are dehydrated and don't know it. So getting enough water is important. Getting exercise is really one of the most important things. It moves the chi. Exercise, especially if it's done with intention to move the chi, as in qigong. So I think learning a type of qigong is especially important for health maintenance. And many people I know who are licensed acupuncturists and oriental medical doctors learned the amazing consequences of practicing qigong and teaching it to their patients, and how that can improve their health even more than getting needled once a month or once a week. Because it's a general tune-up of the whole energy field. So also the martial arts do Tai Chi and things, but the Qigong's built for health, like Wild Goose Qigong, Diane Qigong, or Five Animal Frolics, and there are others. These types of Qigong can really enhance health with regular practice.
Mm-hmm. So alkalized, ionized water, exercise, ideally qigong. Anything else that meditate, walk in nature?
Well, yes, and I would add eating the right diet, and there's probably no one size fits all. But personally, I think organic is very important in this day and age. We have a lot of contamination from the agrochemical industry, and now there's some recent evidence that diabetes, which is becoming more and more epidemic, is not just about high blood sugar and too much sugar in the diet, that it's linked to high toxic load. So we need to clean our bodies. We need to drink pure water. We need to eat food that's not contaminated. And that means to avoid processed food and non-organic food. That includes the GMOs. So you have to buy organic and or grow your own. Better yet. So
Let's talk a little bit about organizations, schools that teach people about these kind of practices. You mentioned Dr. Andrew Weil's program in integrated medicine at the University of Arizona, your Institute for Frontier Sciences, Sophia University, Center for Frontier Sciences at Temple. Is that still there?
no, it was disbanded.
What other groups do you look to? IONS?
Well, California Institute for Human Science is a very good school for educating oneself in life physics, for example, as well as holistic education that involves mind, body, spirit. Highly recommended. Saybrook University has programs in integrative health that are really great for practitioners and researchers who want to learn those approaches, and that's a graduate school, so master's and doctoral program. I must admit I'm not on top of all the education programs out there. I just have my little bit that I do, and there may be others popping up, but I haven't sought them out since I'm not so much in the educational market. I'm a researcher, and I have a part-time practice as a holistic practitioner.
What
But
kind of journals do you look to for the cutting edge information in this field?
well, I'm on the editorial board of Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. This is a very high-level journal that's been around for over 20 years, publishing quality papers. Now, one of the problems in general that you're going to find online is that there are all these new journals that pop up. And I must say I can't keep on top of them all. And I don't know whether some of them are bogus or not. I get invitations just about once a week to join yet another journal. And then when you look deeply into it, these journals are charging $3,000 or so for an author to publish, and they claim they'll put it up right away. Well, they don't make a paper copy, so what's the fee? They want me to be a peer reviewer, but they don't pay us. So, is this a scam? I think so. There are a lot of new journals, and one must beware of and find out what is a scholarly journal with known qualified persons from universities that you recognize versus a journal that's somebody's just setting up online and making money, but publishing papers, just throwing them up online for thousands of dollars. So this has become a hazard in the field because the names of some of these journals sound quite reasonable, but they're not reasonable. And how to vet them has become an issue because there's so very many of them popping up. So, and scholar.google.com, you would think, would relate only to scholarly journals. I'm afraid not. It's all there. You don't know what you're getting fully. So then there are the academic databases. And maybe with that, with databases like PubMed, PubMed.com is the gateway to the National Library of Medicine. That one I would trust. But unfortunately, in the age of information, there's a lot of scams out there. And it's very difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Mm. Mm.
So I buyer beware.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. I'm interested in what well-educated, wise people like you think about our future in the face of climate change, increasing number of autocrats, growing inequality around the world. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic because I think more and more people are waking up to the reality of what's going on this planet, about the inequities, about ruling classes that are sucking wealth from so many of us, about the diminishing middle class in the United States, about the utter poverty in so many nations that we now see blatantly right in front of us watching the internet because of 7 billion cell phones out there and the photos and videos that the public is posting. It opens our hearts to see this, and we feel for our neighbor, those of us who are ready to feel. There's a bifurcation in our society, but more and more people are waking up, and I think they're going to make a difference, and I'm very hopeful about that as they learn more what to do and to send the right people to government and not the people that sell out, which we've had a whole string of those. We need to get the right people in power, and we need to be vigilant in our republic and our democratic process. Otherwise, we lose our freedoms, and it seems to me we're already losing some. So we have to be very careful about this as we move forward. But I'm confident that people are waking up, and I'm hoping to contribute to that process because I've been woken up in viewing many of these things online. It's been maybe even more educational than my education way back when.
I'm hopeful because of the young people leading the climate revolution, they call it, like the 16-year-old in Sweden Greta Thunberg, and she sparked revolution. I mean, that's very encouraging to me.
I watched that girl talk. I'm very impressed. But I have to say a few things about climate change because I think there's, unfortunately, I don't agree with many of the mainstream ideas out there, and I'd like to air those if you don't mind. Because the blame is being placed on us by some of our leaders, saying your carbon footprint is too big.
Yeah.
And that we're raising the CO2 a greenhouse gas. I don't agree with this. First of all, there's no proof that we did it. It's impossible to prove. Secondly, the sun is getting hotter. The sun is heating up all the planets in the solar system. The ice caps on Mars are gone. We didn't do it. I don't think the Martians did it either, folks. So, it's impossible to prove. We have devices today like ionospheric heaters that do experiments on the upper ionosphere, poking holes in it and playing havoc with our weather. I do not believe that a lot of these strange weather patterns that we've been getting are from the burning of fossil fuels and other ways that the average person is expending energy. The finger's been pointing at us, but I don't agree with it. And I know President Trump doesn't either. I have to side with him on this. And
so it's coming from the sun?
The sun is one element. I think it's a complex thing, but I don't think that... Here's another thing. If there's even more volcanic activity on Earth, and I think there has been, then the oceans are heating up. And they are heating up a little. If the oceans heat up, the carbon dioxide dissolved in the oceans come into the air. It's sort of like you take some soda pop, put it on the stove and heat it up. Carbon dioxide comes out. You know this. You leave soda pop, it warms up, the bubbles come out. That's what's happening. More carbon dioxide coming out of the oceans, which are a big reservoir of it. Our little burning of fossil fuel is contributing a little bit, but I don't blame climate change on that. I don't buy it. So I don't think there's much we can do about it as the average person. Now, I want to say I'm all for conserving and not wasting resources. So I agree with that element of the green movement, but I do not agree that we're going to save the planet by cutting down on fossil fuel burning. No. We may be in for some global warming from these devices that people fool around doing experiments on the upper atmosphere. And there are patents on weather control, and they've been in the literature for decades. So you can look for those, and you can learn what I mean. But I think that's more to blame. That and the sun heating up, and all the solar system planets getting warmer is something we can't control. So we may have to live with a warmer planet. We may have to adjust or migrate accordingly. And it's fine to conserve, but I don't think it's going to make a bit of difference. And frankly, nobody can prove the extent to which our behavior in burning fossil fuels makes any difference. There's absolutely no validation or no way to validate that.
What do you do for fun when you're not in your laboratory?
Well, I garden. I love nature, as I said. I really love to get my hands on plants. I like making jewelry. I like touching natural stones. And I like dancing.
What kind?
Well, I used to do ballet in my youth, and now I do exercises like jazzercise. I do some tap dancing. And if I can get around to it, I like ballroom, social dancing as well.
I'm a ballroom dancer. I identify with that. Is there anything else that we should make sure is in this chapter, in this interview, that we haven't talked about?
Well, I'd like to say something to younger people, a lesson that I've learned in life, and that is it's so important to have big dreams and to stick with your dreams no matter what the obstacles are, because I had tremendous obstacles. I was unemployed after being removed from a university for daring to ask really bold questions outside of the box. Now, that didn't stop me. And you know what? I feel a life having been well lived. That's very important. I feel my dreams, at least in part, have been fulfilled. I take a lot of comfort in that. It's not about money, it's not about power, it's not about power over. It's about an internal type of satisfaction that comes from following your dreams. So figuring out what your dreams are, what gives you the greatest passion in life is really important. But it must also help others. It's not to be a self-centered thing. So something that serves the greater whole while inspiring and firing your soul. That's what life's about. And I encourage all of you to pursue your dreams, to become frontier scientists, to uncover new features of the universe and new ways of healing and the full powers of being human. There's so much to be done. That's what inspired me, and I hope that you folks carry on the ball.
Mm-hmm. You know, I should ask you to define consciousness, because that's the underlying concept of the new scientific paradigm. So we better define it.
That's funny because we all know what it is, but hard to put it in words. But you know, we're all sharing in consciousness. We all have an inner life of awareness, perception, sensorium, etc. But I don't know that I can put it in words, to be honest with you. It's an inner knowing being. It's not just perception. It goes beyond that because I think a machine can have perception. And I must say I disagree with some others who would say that someday machines will be conscious. And there's probably an argument about this right now going on among those making robots. They think they're going to make conscious beings that will outdo us. And I think they may outdo us in some processing of information and speed. But I don't think they'll be conscious beings. So perhaps everything alive is conscious at some level. I do have the sense raising chickens and even fish in tanks that there's individuality of consciousness in all those beings. But
What about your bacteria and your cells? Do they have consciousness?
You know, it's interesting. The healers, some of the healers that I worked with thought that they did have consciousness. They felt connected to them. They felt that they could connect in some level of consciousness. I've not been able to do that, I must confess. And every day I brush my teeth, I kill a few million bacteria. I'm well aware of it. Necessarily so. So, you know, I don't worry about that too much. It's a matter of survival of maybe the highest good here.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's all pervasive in the universe. So it's within us. It's also all pervasive. And I don't believe it's generated by the brain. And that's the difference between maybe mainstream science and some of us who are more cutting edge. We see maybe the brain as a transducer of consciousness that is really all pervasive. And then we each have a unique receptor for it. So then we operate accordingly. The brain is more like a receptor, but I would say the whole body is a receptor, and the consciousness is not just in the brain. It's throughout the being. So,
right. Thank you. That's a good note to end on. I really appreciate your insights, and what an interesting discussion. Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.